So this year's hurricane season expected to have activity that's above average still. Experts say you should take some time right about now to check on your insurance policies. Make sure you have everything you might need. The start of hurricane season just 3 weeks away, and the Insurance Council of Texas says you should make sure you're covered now. Big thing to remember, once there's a storm in the Gulf, you cannot get coverage. Camille Garcia with the Insurance Council says there are 3 categories of coverage you should have.
Coastal residents especially need to be aware and to cover themselves with 3 different policies. First, a standard homeowners policy. Second, if you do live along the Gulf Coast, you will probably need a windstorm policy. And third, a flood policy for that storm surge protection.
While most homeowners are required to have windstorm insurance, it does not necessarily have to come from the Texas Windstorm Insurance Association, or TWIA. She says many commercial companies now provide windstorm insurance. By the way, looking back at the last hurricane season, 13 of the 30 named storms we had were hurricanes. 6 of them became major hurricanes. So there you go.